So would you give a really warm welcome for Sheela as she comes to speak to us?
Hi everyone, Happy Chinese New Year. It's a privilege to stand here at the start of the new year yet again. I always joke that Chinese New Year is really when the year begins, right? Jan 1st is just a dress rehearsal. But however you view it, I hope you've had a festive celebration eating lots of good food. So a few weekends ago, I helped a friend to babysit their children. And as I was observing these children in their natural state at home, I was reminded how fascinating children can be. I mean, have you ever noticed how children are just really good at living in the moment? They don't worry about tomorrow, they're not thinking about yesterday's tough day at work or at school. They're just really focused on the moment. And in this case, the youngest boy, he was playing his video games and the older brother was practicing his guitar. But whatever children do, it always has their undivided attention. They always seem so purposeful about things. And it just makes me wonder, I can't remember the last time that I was fully present in the moment for an extended period of time. I wonder when was the last time you were fully present in the moment for an extended period of time. There's always something to worry about, something to plan for, something to reflect on. And it's not that I want to be carefree or free of responsibilities like a child, but it was just the realization that even though I'm living in the present, my mind spends a lot of its time dwelling on the past, thinking about the things that could have been or should have been, or it spends a lot of time looking at the future, planning for the things that I want to happen. And it doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about the present or being in the present. And if people around me are a good gauge of what the general population feels like, I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one in this room who feels that way. And it's with that thought that I kind of want to take on the passage for today, which is 1 Samuel chapter 16. What can we learn from this passage about the lens through which we need to view the past, the present, and the future? But before we dive into the passage, it would be helpful to know what has happened in the book of Samuel so far. So Samuel, he was a great prophet and a great leader of Israel. And in his time, at that time, Israel didn't have a king because God was supposed to lead them. God was supposed to be their king. But the people of Israel, they saw the other nations around them and they wanted a king. And so they demanded of God for a king. And God was like, no, trust me, you do not want a human king. You think a human king is going to solve all your problems, but not only will he not solve them, he will probably make things worse. But the Israelites, they insist and they still demand that they want a king. And so God granted them their wish, and he sent Samuel, the prophet Samuel, to go and find this guy called Saul to appoint him as king. But Saul, he kind of messes up, and he, on two major occasions, he disobeys God greatly, and this angers God. And God, he rejects Saul as king, and then he sends Samuel to once again go and find another person called David, and that is to anoint David as king. And that is where we enter the passage for today. 1 Samuel chapter 16. The Lord said to Samuel, How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Later in verse 4, Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, Do you come in peace? Samuel replied, Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, The Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendant said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre." So the lyre, it's a musical instrument, and it looks kind of like the harp. So David was known for being quite skillful at playing this instrument. Verse 16, "He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man." I'm not sure why fine-looking man is a factor in this case. "And the Lord is with him." Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul, he would feel better, and this evil spirit would leave him. There is a lot that we can learn from these 3 key characters: Samuel, Saul, and David. And the first perspective that we learn about is the perspective that we should take on for the past. I stumbled across this photo on the internet the other day. I think it was taken in Vienna. From the photo, you can sort of tell that this guy is probably on holiday. He's probably with his family because someone's taking the photo. He looks like he's somewhat kind of having a good time. Traveling, it is a time to kind of make good memories, right? We go traveling, we take photos, and we reflect on these photos for the good memories that have happened. But then we see the full picture. Same moment, very, very different experience, very, very different memory. It's almost impossible to look back on the past objectively. We tend to exaggerate it. We look back on a negative experience and we make it sound worse than it was. And we look back on a good experience and we make it sound more amazing than it was. 2 people's experience will never be described the same, as you can see in the picture. The bad experiences become worse, the good experiences become amazing. But what we can learn from this passage is this: the past is for learning and not for yearning. There's 2 things that tend to happen when we look at the past. The first is we look at all the negative things in regret and we yearn for a past that looks different. Or the other thing that happens is we look at all the positive things that have happened we looked at that wishfully and we hope and long for a today that looks just the same as yesterday. And we see the prophet Samuel go through these 2 mindsets in this passage and how God brings him out of it. So the first verse in the chapter, we read God say this to Samuel in verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." And it's one verse that says so many things. We get an idea, a picture of Samuel's state at this time, and you can almost imagine him in that moment. He was the one who anointed and appointed Saul as the first king over Israel. And you get a picture of how he must have had hopes and dreams for the kind of king that Saul would be. And I wonder what kind of hopes and dreams do you maybe have over your own life or over the people around you? And when Saul didn't live up to Samuel's hopes and dreams and ideas, Samuel was clearly upset and must have spent his days regretting all that had happened. He was probably thinking of himself as well, how he could have guided Saul better or mentored him better, taught him better. And do you sometimes do that? So I don't know why, my mind does this thing before I sleep sometimes, and it looks a bit like this comic. It's like when your brain comes and just before you sleep, it says, hey, just FYI, before you get to sleep, that stupid thing you said earlier will resonate with the people who heard it forever and ever. Okay, good night. And then it just kind of leaves you to fall asleep or not fall asleep because you're thinking. And I don't know why it does this. It just decides to remember all the mistakes I've made in the day, all the conversations that could have gone better. I start thinking like, oh, this should have happened, that should have happened, I should have said this, I should have done that. And things would have turned out differently. And we do this for the small things, and it's so much worse for the bigger things that go wrong. And in all of that, God is asking us, how long more will you mourn? He then says to Samuel, hey, snap out of it. There has to be a point for you to move on. And here's the most important part. He then tells Samuel what to do next, which is to go and find David. Essentially, God is saying that you are yearning for what could have been, but I am going to show you what will be, and it's better. So don't look back on the negative and dwell on it. But further down, we read how Samuel sees Eliab, Jesse's oldest son, and he thinks that he is the one that looks right to be king because of his appearance. We read in verses 6 to 7, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So why was Samuel so quick to jump to that conclusion initially? Well, we can understand kind of what he's thinking when we look back just a few chapters. The Bible describes Saul's appearance and Saul's looks. They describe him as a tall, handsome young man. So Saul was a handsome, tall young man. And so when Samuel saw Eliab, yet another handsome, tall man, he must have thought, this is Saul version 2.0. Samuel was trying to find another Saul. He was trying to take what was good in the past and project that to create the future. And we tend to do that, right? We have for ourselves an idea of something that's good, something that might have worked in the past, something that we're comfortable with, and we latch on to those things. It's like when you lose your favorite pen, or you lose your favorite jacket, and when you try to buy a replacement, that's kind of exactly the same as the thing that you lost. And I guess we can do that with a lot of things. We paint an outward picture of what good looks like based on past experience. What a good family looks like, what a good marriage looks like, a good friendship, a good career. We want so badly for things to stay the same. There's a famous quote by this guy called Henry Ford. You might have heard of him. He's the founder of Ford Motors. And this quote, it always comes up in conversations or articles about innovation. And he says this, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And lucky for us, instead of faster horses, he focused instead on making cars affordable, hence transforming the history of the transportation industry. As we read on the passage, we see God immediately corrected Samuel and essentially says the same thing. You might think you know a good thing when you see it, but I have something different and it's better. Don't look back on the positive and try to preserve it. And in both cases, the good and the bad experiences, the past is just a series of events for us to learn from, and that leads us to today. We can't look back to change it or preserve it, but in all of it, God is at work to help us to learn to be more and more the people that He has made us to be. And all those experiences have brought us here to where we are today, which is exactly where you and I need to be. So view the past through a lens of learning and not yearning. But how about the future? The future is not about moving forwards towards a goal, but it's about moving upwards towards God. When Samuel anoints David, we read that the Spirit of God shifts from Saul to David. In the Old Testament, the Spirit of God only rested on certain people at certain times for certain reasons. And this time it was the anointing to be king. And the anointing had shifted from Saul to David. We read in verses 13 and 14 where this happens. So in verse 13, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And further down in verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. And then we read a short paragraph that Saul was disturbed by an evil spirit. Why did that happen? And it's not that God actively sent evil upon Saul. God doesn't initiate evil. But when God's spirit shifted from Saul to David, it's as if God removed his protection and covering over Saul, allowing evil spirits to now come upon Saul. And when that happens, he invites David to play the harp in order to drive the spirit away. And this scene is the first scene of many points of interaction between these two characters. And in it, we already start to see the differences between the two of them that get more and more exaggerated as we carry on reading about their lives. At this point, Saul knows that God has rejected him. He knows this because Samuel had told him. But yet, he chooses to hang on to it tightly. And when he faces the evil spirit, instead of himself seeking God for help, he chooses short-term relief through David's music. Eventually, as you carry on reading the book of Samuel, and I highly recommend it, it's very fascinating, very dramatic, we read how as Saul gets more and more fixated on being king, he loses sight of God and he gets further and further away from God. And he becomes really super paranoid about David, and he tries time and time again to kill David. But in contrast, David, who has been told that he will be king, never tries to force it to happen. And in fact, he spends most of his time for the rest of the book of Samuel running away as a refugee from Saul. But regardless of what's going on, David stays close to God and lets God guide him. In Proverbs, there's a verse that says, "A man's heart plans his ways, but the Lord determines his steps." God wrote the blueprint of our design. He knows us better than we do. But often the case is that we don't consult the blueprint, but we charge forward towards where we want to go. It's like God says, "I've built you to be a Ferrari." But we say that we want to be a bicycle. And God says, "But no, you are a Ferrari." And we say, "I still want to be a bicycle." And we continue planning and building our lives around being the best bicycle that we can be, instead of seeking God on how we can live out our lives as the best possible race car. And maybe that's not the best analogy, but it's kind of what happens in this case. Saul, he had one goal for his life. That was to remain king. And when Saul looked towards the future, he couldn't imagine one outside of being king, and so he chased it to no end. And the irony for Saul is that the more he chased it, the further that it slipped away from him. Do you perhaps maybe have a goal for what you want your life to look like? And would you be able to let God steer you out of your plans and into his plans? We don't know what would have become of Saul if he had chosen to seek God's new will for his life. It's often said God never calls us out of something without then calling you into something. And I've seen, for what it's worth, I've seen this happen in my own life in a few occasions. When I was in my final year at uni, I had this really strong feeling, or gut feeling you can call it, that I had to go back to Malaysia, here, to KL, to kind of build my life there again. And but it was really tough because it took me 3 years studying in university there to kind of root myself in community. And I finally had a church that I was rooted in. I finally had community that I was rooted in. And it was out of that I really felt that tugging, that God was pulling me back to Malaysia. But now, of course, looking back on the last 4+ years that I've been back, I can't imagine a life outside of what I'm doing right now. But in that moment, as I was praying, if I had chosen to stay in London, if I had chosen to really just pursue what I wanted, found a job there, settled down there, God is gracious, and I don't think He would have stopped me. But I don't think I would have been able to build a life as eventful, as exciting, as fulfilling as the one that He's given me here. And the reverse is true as well. So Miles said that I used to work as a management consultant. I used to work for Accenture, and now I work for Frog Asia. And that shift happened last year when I left Accenture to join Frog. And what some people don't know, or many people don't know, is that actually in my time at Accenture, 3.5 years there was a lot of points where I felt kind of restless, like I wanted to leave. You know, as millennials, we can never make up our minds. But yeah, so there were many points in those 3 years that I wanted to leave, but every time I did, and I prayed about it, I always felt God say to me, it's not the right time. And if I had chosen to stay on, again, God is gracious, and if I had chosen to leave at those points, I'm sure that He would have allowed me to. I would have been able to apply for other jobs. But again, the moment I felt that release, that I was okay to leave, everything fell into place. And I know that where I am right now is where I should be, and it feels right. Are you willing to let God steer you out of your plans and into His? We can continue to have our plans and chart our way into the future like Saul. And after all, he did remain king. He did remain king all the way until he died. But it probably wasn't the kind of life as a king that he would have imagined. And it's not that making plans and having goals are bad. And in fact, it is very good to make plans and have goals. But in that, are we listening to God? Are we listening to whether our goals and our plans are aligned to His? So look towards the future, not towards moving forward to a goal, but in moving upwards towards God, He will then direct our steps into the future. So look to the future through the lens of God's direction and instruction. And that leaves us with the present. I wonder what you think of when you hear the phrase, live in the moment. This phrase tends to be associated with being spontaneous, with being youthful, with fun, sometimes even recklessness. When I think of living in a moment, I think of the Nike phrase, just do it. I think of things like going on an unplanned holiday or buying something for myself that's really expensive or doing something dangerous. Living in the moment is about the excitement, about feeling alive. Our idea of living in the moment is to try to make the best of each moment, to make every moment a big moment, a moment that's worth talking about or sharing on Instagram. But actually, there is a very big difference between living in the moment and living for these moments. And I'm sure we can all relate to the latter. We live for the weekend. We live for the next public holiday. We live for the next cool gadget or the next travel getaway. And even at work, we look for markets. We work for the next promotion, for the year-end bonus. We work for that moment of recognition by our colleagues or our bosses. And even though there's nothing wrong with these things in isolation, the reality is that most of our lives are not made up of these moments. They are made up of the uneventful stuff, sitting in jams, typing out reports at work, sending children to school, doing household chores. But we downplay these moments and we even label it this really unsexy thing. We call it the mundane moments. But really, how should we view these moments? So let's take a look back at the story of David. David's real claim to fame is the moment that he defeats the giant Goliath. And you might be familiar with the story. The Israelites were at risk of being attacked by the Philistines, and David saves them by killing Goliath with his slingshot. And what we can tend to do with the story of David is we focus on these glory moments. Now, just for a moment, let's imagine David had an Instagram account. His top 3 posts would probably look a bit like this. What we see here are the highlights, the big Instagram-worthy moments. Over here, he gets anointed by Samuel, just got anointed, future king, hashtag what happens now. Over here, we see he plays his harp for the king, hashtag made it in life. And over there, we see he slays the giant, hashtag slayed. But when we see this, Miles, I didn't know you followed David on... But what we see in these points in the story is it gives us something to aim for, right? These highlights, and it's good. But what we also need to know is that there are moments there are moments in between these pictures. There are moments in between the highlights. Between here and here, there's time spent away from this, and between here and here, there's time spent away from that. So what actually happens in between the highlights? We read this at the end of the passage in verse 19. When Saul is looking for a musician, it says this. Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." David is with the sheep. It means that after being anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel, what happens next is as normal as he goes back to his day job, tending to the sheep. And it isn't for another 15 to 20 years until he actually becomes king. Between David's anointing and appointing as king, there was a period of refining. And it's the same for us. God doesn't waste time. And often we think that our big purpose, our calling, is this big event that we need to strive for, to reach for far in the future, when actually the real call is faithfulness in the present. Whatever that may be, David's work as a shepherd was just as much his calling as his defeating Goliath and as his time as king. And maybe on some days, or sometimes in long seasons, it can feel like the present is just killing time for the real action to happen. It feels like just another day as a shepherd on the field when really we want to be fighting giants. But what we learn from David is that it's really in the daily grind where God does his best work in us, teaching us and refining us. David's mundane moments was being out on the fields, tending to the sheep and protecting them from bears and lions. Day in and day out, he's tending to the sheep, protecting them from bears and lions. Until one day, unexpectedly, he has to face this giant. But when it happens, he's ready. And why is he ready? Because it's the same skills that he used to fight the bears and the lions on the field that he uses to then kill and defeat Goliath. I mean, talk about transferable skills, right? So the field prepared him for the fight. And I wonder, what is your field? What are the seemingly mundane and normal activities today that is really your training for tomorrow? And it could look like many things. Turning up to work on time, doing your best with every piece of work that comes your way, speaking kindly of people, investing time in building relationships, spending time with family. Don't despise the small things, for they matter the most in the long run. Living in the moment is not about making significant moments. It's about finding the significance in each moment. All throughout the narrative of the Bible, we get this picture of how God, even though he has the overarching plan, his provision for us is in the present. It's daily. We are taught to pray for our daily bread. We know that God's grace and his mercies are renewed every day. It's why we are encouraged to speak to God daily and to read the Bible daily, because he is active in the present and speaks to us in the present. The promise is that when we seek him, he will guide us just as how he guided David. Every day, as part of our daily bread, we are given a portion of things to be faithful in that prepare and lead us into the next step. David is known by the people of Israel as the greatest king of Israel because of his leadership. But David is known by God as the greatest king of Israel because of his heart for God. Every step of the way, from shepherd boy to king of Israel, he relied on God to provide for him and to lead him. And today we can do the same as David. We too can trust and rely on God to lead us. And we can know that He is for us through the person of Jesus, the ultimate king. David and Saul were kings of their time, but they were just a foreshadowing of the king that was to come, and that is Jesus. Like David, Jesus was the king we would have never expected. Jesus was born in a rented stable and buried in a borrowed tomb. He spent most of his life working as a carpenter and most of his ministry with an average team spending time with the fringes of society. Nothing about his life shouted Messiah, and yet he was the only one who could save us. Saul was a king rejected for what he had done, but Jesus was a king rejected for what we have done. Saul's sin caused a separation between him and God, causing God's Spirit to leave him. But on the cross, Jesus bore the consequences of our sin in order that we are put in a right relationship with God, never having to face that same separation from God. And hence, just like David, we too can be guided and led by God through His Spirit. On the cross, Jesus has dealt with our past so that we don't have to dwell in it. And Jesus, He's interested in and He cares for our future so that we don't have to worry about it. But ultimately, He wants to meet us and lead us in the present, in our today, and in our everyday. And He wants to meet us even right now. Shall we stand? In this story, we read that often God speaks to David, or David speaks to God through God's Spirit that's resting on him. And God's Spirit is here in this room. He's very much present here, and He wants to be speaking to us. So maybe let's take a moment to just listen in and see what He wants to say. You might want to open your hands out. It's just good body language for ourselves to know that we are open. Holy Spirit, we welcome Your presence here today. Would You come and fill us afresh? Would You be speaking to us even right now?